In the golden light of dawn, Thomas Miller's weathered hands moved methodically through his modest vegetable garden, each precious tomato and ear of corn barely enough to sustain his own family through the harsh winter ahead. But when he noticed a small figure watching from beyond his fence, a child with hollow cheeks and hopeful eyes, something deep within him stirred. Without hesitation, he gathered an extra bundle of his freshest produce and walked it to the child's door, never expecting how this simple act of kindness would change everything. The next morning, as the sun painted his struggling farm in shades of amber, 4 gleaming SUVs appeared on his dusty road. The last vehicle's door opened, revealing a face he hadn't seen in decades. How could he have known that sharing his meager harvest would lead to the greatest harvest of all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Miller's morning ritual hadn't changed in 20 years. Each day began with the gentle tick of his grandfather's pocket watch, a weathered timepiece that had marked the hours of 3 generations of farmers. In the pre-dawn darkness, he would draw it from his nightstand, thumb tracing the worn brass surface as he checked the time. 4:30 a.m., precise as ever. The watch had been his constant companion since his father's passing, a reminder of simpler times when the Miller farm had been the pride of Chester County. Now, as Thomas pulled on his work boots in the dim light of his kitchen, that legacy weighed heavily on his shoulders. The farm's prosperity had waned with each passing season, leaving him to wonder if he would be the last Miller to work this land. He paused at the kitchen window, coffee mug warming his calloused hands. The first hints of sunrise painted the eastern sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold, illuminating the 40 acres that had been his whole world since childhood. The drought had left the soil dusty and unforgiving, the cornstalks shorter than they should be this late in the season. But there was still beauty here, in the way morning dew clung to spider webs between fence posts, in the familiar creak of the old barn door, in the soft whisper of wind through the remaining healthy crops. The sound of his boots on the porch. Steps startled a family of cardinals from their perch on the railing. Thomas watched them scatter into the dawn sky, remembering how his mother used to say that red birds were good luck. She'd been gone 30 years now, leaving nothing but fading memories and an empty chair at the dinner table. Some days he could barely recall her face. He retrieved his grandfather's watch from his pocket, running his thumb over its scratched crystal face. Inside the case was a small photograph, creased and yellowed with age. His mother on her last day at the farm, dressed in her city clothes, standing beside his teenage self. Her smile hadn't quite reached her eyes that day. The next morning, she'd left for Philadelphia, chasing dreams bigger than their small farming community could contain. The distant rumble of Jake Henderson's tractor carried across the morning air. His neighbor had already started his day, probably facing the same challenges that plagued all the local farmers: rising costs, falling crop prices, and the ever-present threat of corporate buyouts. Last month, the Wilson family had sold their farm to a development company. Soon, suburban homes would replace the cornfields that had fed the community for generations. Thomas tucked the watch back into his pocket and headed toward his vegetable garden. It wasn't much, just a quarter-acre plot beside the house, but it provided enough to keep food on his table and a little extra to sell at the weekend farmers' market. The tomato plants were heavy with fruit, their vines supported by stakes fashioned from old fence posts. Between the rows, marigolds bloomed orange and yellow, planted to deter pests the way his grandmother had taught him. He was checking the ripeness of a particularly promising tomato when movement caught his eye. There, beyond the garden fence, stood a small figure, a girl, maybe 10 or 11, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore clothes that seemed a size too small, and her eyes held that particular kind of hunger that came from more than just missing breakfast. Thomas recognized her from town, Sarah Thompson, daughter of Mark Thompson, who'd lost his job at the textile mill when it closed last year. The Thompsons had moved into the old Johnson rental house down the road, a place that had seen better days long before they arrived. The girl didn't run when their eyes met. Instead, she offered a shy wave, her gaze drifting to the ripe vegetables within his reach. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a memory of his own childhood hunger in the years after his father died, before he'd learned to make the farm profitable again. He glanced at his harvest, enough for his needs barely, then back at Sarah's hopeful face. The decision formed in his heart before his mind could catch up with practical concerns. Sometimes he realized the right choice was the one that made no logical sense at all. As he gathered a few tomatoes and a couple of ears of corn into his harvest basket, Thomas remembered something his father used to say: "The land provides for those who tend it, and those who tend it must provide for others." It had been years since he'd thought of those words, but now they echoed in his mind with renewed meaning. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the garden as Thomas continued his work. Every so often, he would glance up, to see Sarah still watching, her presence a gentle reminder that sometimes the greatest harvests come not from what we keep, but from what we choose to share. The old barn needed clearing before winter set in. Thomas had been putting it off for weeks, but the morning's encounter with Sarah had stirred something in him, a need to connect with his past, perhaps, or simply to keep his hands busy while his mind worked through the morning's events. Inside the barn, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that penetrated the weathered boards. The musty scent of hay mingled with the sharper smell of old engine oil from his father's tractor, now sitting silent in the corner. He started with the workbench, sorting through decades of accumulated tools and memories. Behind a stack of outdated seed catalogues, he found the box. Cardboard, water-stained, held together with twine his mother had tied 30 years ago. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid, releasing the scent of forgotten summers and lost possibilities. The photograph lay on top, protected by a clear plastic sleeve that had yellowed with age. Thomas recognized the moment instantly, his high school graduation day. He stood between his parents, his father's pride evident in his broad smile, his mother's ambition visible in her straight-backed posture and carefully styled hair. Even then, she had seemed somehow separate from the farm life around her, like a bird poised for flight. Beneath the photograph lay a stack of letters, their envelopes postmarked from Philadelphia in those first few years after she'd left. He'd stopped reading them eventually, each one filled with descriptions of a life he couldn't quite imagine. Board meetings, charity galas, corporate mergers. The last letter had arrived 15 years ago, containing a check he'd never cashed and promises of a visit that never materialized. The sound of tires on gravel drew his attention. Through the barn door, he could see Jake Henderson's truck pulling up to the fence. Jake had been more than a neighbor these past decades. He'd become the brother Thomas never had, sharing equipment, labor, and the unspoken understanding that came from working the same land year after year. "Thought I might find you hiding." "In here," Jake called out, climbing down from his truck. He was a tall man with sun-weathered skin and eyes that crinkled at the corners from years of squinting at the horizon. "Saw the little Thompson girl watching your garden this morning." Thomas carefully returned the photograph to its box. "Sarah," he said. "Her father lost his job at the mill." Jake nodded, leaning against the workbench. "Whole town's changing, Tom. Wilson's place sold for $2 million. Developers already got the permits for 100 houses." He paused, studying Thomas's face. "Had any more thoughts about their offer?" The development company's letter sat unopened on Thomas's kitchen table. Their initial proposal had been generous, more money than the farm had made in the past decade, but the thought of bulldozers tearing up his family's legacy made his stomach turn. "Can't do it, Jake, not yet." Thomas stood, brushing dust from his jeans. "Still got some fight left in me." Jake's expression softened. "Your father would be proud, you know." Way you've kept this place going all these years." He gestured toward the box of photographs. "Found some memories, did you?" Thomas picked up the graduation photo again. "Just thinking about choices. Paths not taken." He studied his mother's face in the image, trying to see what she had seen back then. The limitations of farm life, the allure of the city, the promise of something more. "Funny thing about paths," Jake said, straightening up. "Sometimes they circle back around. Saw some fancy cars heading toward town this morning. Don't get many of those out here." Thomas's hand tightened slightly on the photograph. 4 SUVs. Zara's hopeful face, his mother's last letter, pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite assemble. The morning sun had climbed higher, and through the barn door he could see Sarah making her way down the road again, this time with a younger boy in tow. "Life has a way of surprising you," Thomas said, more to himself than to Jake. He carefully returned the photograph to its box, but the image stayed with him. 3 people frozen in time, each on the verge of choices that would reshape their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. Outside, the September wind carried the promise of change, rustling through the cornstalks and stirring up memories as persistent as the dust in the old barn's rafters. The next morning, Thomas found it tucked beneath a stone at his gate, a piece of lined paper folded into careful quarters. The edges were slightly crumpled, as if the artist had second-guessed the decision to leave it several times. When he unfolded it, his breath caught in his throat. The drawing was done in crayon, the kind schoolchildren used, but there was something striking in its simplicity. His farmhouse stood center page, rendered in confident brown strokes, with the red barn beside it. The garden sprawled across the bottom of the page in a riot of green and red circles that could only be tomatoes. In the corner, a small figure watched from behind a carefully drawn fence. But it was the sky that held his attention. Instead of simple blue, the artist had used yellow and pink and orange, capturing perfectly the dawn light he witnessed every morning. At the bottom, in careful schoolgirl script, "Thank you for sharing your garden, Sarah T." Thomas stood at his gate, longer than necessary, the drawing trembling slightly in his weathered hands. Through the decades of working this land, he'd forgotten how it might look through fresh eyes, not as a burden of responsibility and tradition, but as something magical, worthy of crayon skies and careful observation. The sound of a screen door slamming echoed from the direction of the old Johnson place. Thomas folded the drawing and slipped it into his shirt pocket, next to his grandfather's watch. The morning stretched before him with its usual tasks, but his mind kept returning to Sarah's rendering of his world. By mid-morning, the story of his interaction with Sarah had made its way through the local grapevine. Chester County was small enough that any deviation from routine became worthy of discussion. Mabel at the general store mentioned it when he stopped for coffee, her tone carefully neutral but her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Heard you've been talking to Mark Thompson's girl," she said, measuring out his usual quarter-pound of nails. "Poor thing's had it rough since they moved here. Her mama passed last winter. Cancer, they say. Mark's been doing his best, but..." She left the sentence hanging, heavy with unspoken implications. Thomas thought of his own mother's departure. How different it was from the permanent absence Sarah faced. "Sometimes life deals hard hands," he said quietly, gathering his purchases. "Speaking of hard hands," Mabel continued, lowering her voice, "heard anything more about those development folks? Ruth Wilson says they're offering double what they paid for her place if anyone else is interested in selling." The familiar weight of anxiety settled in Thomas's stomach. The developer's letter seemed to burn in his pocket, right next to Sarah's drawing. 2 futures, side by side, one promising financial security, the other reminding him of why he stayed. On his drive home, he passed the old Johnson house. It needed paint and new shutters, and the front steps sagged dangerously to one side. But there were signs of care. A swept walkway, carefully tended marigolds that looked suspiciously like offspring of his own plants, and a small vegetable patch struggling to take root in the hard-packed soil. Sarah sat on the front steps, another piece of paper on her lap, crayons scattered around her. She looked up as his truck slowed, offering a shy wave. Behind her, through the screen door, Thomas caught a glimpse of a man about his own age, thin and tired-looking, but with Sarah's same watchful eyes. Before he could second-guess himself, Thomas pulled into the gravel driveway. The drawing in his pocket seemed to urge him forward, a bridge between his solitary world and this small family trying to find their footing. Mark Thompson came too. The door as Thomas approached, his expression a mixture of wariness and resignation, the look of a man accustomed to difficult conversations with authority figures. But Thomas wasn't here as a landlord or bill collector. He was here as a neighbor, carrying a lifetime of lessons about survival and community. "Mr. Thompson," Thomas said, removing his cap, "I wanted to thank Sarah for her beautiful drawing." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "And I noticed your vegetable patch. Soil's tough here, but I might have some suggestions, if you're interested." Something shifted in Mark Thompson's tired face. A glimmer of hope, perhaps, or simple relief at an unexpected kindness. Sarah beamed from her perch on the steps, already reaching for a fresh piece of paper. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the peeling paint and illuminating the possibilities that lay hidden in simple acts of connection. Dawn found Thomas in his garden earlier than usual, a woven basket from his grandmother's time balanced in the crook of his arm. He moved with deliberate care through the rows, selecting each item with the same attention he'd once watched his mother use at the farmer's market, before she'd traded rural life for city lights. The first tomatoes went in, still carrying morning dew, not the largest ones, but the most perfectly ripe, their red skins promising sweetness. Then 2 heads of lettuce, the leaves crisp and tender. Young carrots came next, their feathery tops still attached, followed by a handful of snap peas that had survived the summer heat. Each selection felt like writing a letter, every vegetable carrying its own message of care. "You're up early," Jake called from the fence line, startling a pair of mourning doves into flight. "Market's not till Saturday?" Thomas straightened, his knees creaking slightly. "Not for market," he replied, adding a couple of bell peppers to the basket. "For the Thompsons." Jake leaned on the fence post, his expression thoughtful. "Heard about the drawing she left you. Mary says the girl's got talent." He paused, watching Thomas select an ear of corn. "You know, place that size. They probably don't have a proper root cellar. Might need some advice about storage." The suggestion hung in the air between them, laden with years of shared knowledge about survival through winter months. Thomas added it to his mental list, alongside the soil amendments Mark's garden would need and the foundation repairs the old Johnson house required. He was arranging the vegetables in the basket when Sarah appeared at the garden gate, this time with her father hanging back by the road. She carried another drawing, rolled carefully and tied with a frayed ribbon. "Morning, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice carrying the formal tone of a child who'd been coached in manners. "Dad says we can't take any more vegetables unless you let us help with the garden." Thomas glanced at Mark Thompson, recognizing in the man's stance the familiar struggle between pride and necessity. He'd seen that same tension in his own father's shoulders during the drought of '82, when accepting help had felt like admitting defeat. "Well," Thomas said, setting his basket down, "I was just telling your father yesterday about needing some help with the fall planting. Timing's important with winter vegetables, and an extra pair of hands would make a difference." He turned to Mark. "Pays fair. Part cash, part produce. Could use the help through harvest, at least." The relief that crossed Mark's face was almost painful to witness. "I know my way around a garden," he said, stepping forward. "Had a small farm myself back in Ohio, before the bank took it." Sarah unrolled her drawing while the men talked details. This one showed the garden from above, like a map, with careful labels for each vegetable row. In one corner, she'd drawn 3 figures working together among the plants. By the time Thomas walked them back to their house, basket full of vegetables. Balanced on his hip, the sun had cleared the eastern tree line. Mark carried a spare pair of work gloves and a handwritten schedule for the next week's planting. Sarah skipped ahead of them, already planning where each vegetable would go in their kitchen. The old Johnson house looked different in the morning. Light, less a symbol of hard times and more a place of potential. Thomas found himself noting the loose boards on the porch, the gap under the front door where winter drafts would creep in. His father had been handy with household repairs, and Thomas had inherited both his tools and his knowledge. Inside, the house was clean but sparse. A stack of moving boxes still lined one wall, and the furniture showed signs of careful mending. But there were touches of home emerging, Sarah's drawings taped to the walls, a row of sprouting plants. In soup cans on the windowsill, the faint scent of coffee from Mark's morning routine. Thomas helped them unpack the basket, showing Sarah how to tell which tomatoes should be used first and which could wait. He explained about storing root vegetables in damp sand, the way his grandmother had taught him, and promised to bring some. Proper storage containers next time. When he finally turned to leave, Sarah pressed her latest drawing into his hands. "For your collection," she said solemnly, as if she knew about the box of memories in his barn. Outside, the morning had bloomed into full autumn glory. Thomas paused at his truck, watching father and daughter arrange vegetables on their worn kitchen counter through the window. The drawing in his hand showed not just the garden this time, but a path leading from his house to theirs, drawn in bold strokes that suggested something permanent. A flash of movement caught his eye, a cardinal, bright as a flame, landing on the Johnson house gutters. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Red birds are good luck, Tommy. They show up when change is coming." He touched his grandfather's. Watched through his shirt pocket, its steady ticking a reminder that time moved in only one direction, carrying all of them forward into whatever waited ahead. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, the bank's logo stark against the white paper. Thomas recognized it immediately. The same type of letter that had arrived at the Wilson farm 3 months before their sale. His hands were still dirt-stained. From the morning's work when he opened it, the crisp paper incongruous against his weathered fingers. "Notice of potential foreclosure," the heading read. Below, in carefully worded paragraphs, lay the arithmetic of his failure: missed payments, accumulated interest, declining property values. The final paragraph offered what they called alternative solutions, including a reference to Chester Valley Development Corporation, the same company that had bought the Wilson place. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in with the weight of generations of Miller family history. Thomas pulled his grandfather's watch from his pocket, its steady, ticking a counterpoint to his racing thoughts. 3 generations of farmers had kept this land going through drought, depression, and disaster. Now it might end with him. Mark's voice drifted through the open window from the garden, where he was teaching Sarah about proper seed spacing. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm over the past weeks, the 3 of them working together in the cooling autumn mornings. Sarah's vegetable drawings had given way to more ambitious projects, detailed plans for winter greenhouses, sketches of innovative irrigation systems she'd learned about in science class. "Mr. Miller," Sarah called out. "Come see what we found." Thomas tucked the letter into his back pocket, its presence heavy as a stone. Outside, Sarah knelt by the potato patch, carefully brushing dirt from something half buried in the soil. "Look," she said, holding up a tarnished medal on a frayed ribbon. "Dad says it's from the war." Thomas took the medal gently. "Your grandfather's," he told Mark, who stood watching with interest. "He won it in the Pacific, buried it here when he came home, said he'd grown better memories in this soil." The medal's surface was corroded, but the eagle emblem remained visible. Thomas had watched his father bury it, had promised never to dig it up. But here it was, surfacing now, as if the land itself was offering up its secrets. A sleek black car drove past the farm entrance, slowing slightly. Through the tinted windows, Thomas caught a glimpse of suits and briefcases. His hand tightened around the medal. "Everything okay?" Mark asked, noting Thomas's expression. Been seeing more of those fancy cars lately. Before Thomas could respond, Jake's truck pulled up in a cloud of dust. His normally cheerful face was creased with worry. "Tom," he called out, climbing down. "Just came from the bank. They're calling in loans all over the county. Wilson's sale set some kind of precedent. They're saying our land's worth more for development than farming." Sarah looked up from her sketchpad, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. Even at her young age, she seemed to sense the tension in the adults' voices. "How many?" Thomas asked, already knowing the answer would hurt. 6 farms this morning. Henderson's, Clark's, Patel's, all got notices." Jake glanced at the paper protruding from Thomas's pocket. "You too, huh?" Mark stepped forward, his face set with determination. "My uncle's a lawyer in Philadelphia, specializes in property law. I could give him a call." A second black car passed by, this one moving even slower. Thomas watched it disappear around the bend, remembering another sleek vehicle from decades ago, the one that had taken his mother away to a new life in the city. "Sarah," he said quietly, "why don't you show your father that irrigation system you were designing, the one with the rain barrels?" The girl nodded, understanding she was being given an adult moment. She gathered her drawings and tugged her father toward their latest project, leaving Thomas and Jake by the potato patch. "Options?" Thomas asked once they were alone. Jake sighed, leaning against his truck. "Bank's offering 60 days to pursue alternatives. After that," he left the sentence unfinished, but they both knew what came next. Auctions, subdivisions, the end of a way of life. Thomas looked down at the war medal in his hand, its weight somehow comforting. His grandfather had faced worse odds, had rebuilt from nothing after the war. The letter in his pocket was just paper after all. The real wealth was here, in the soil, in the community, in the trust reflected in Sarah's drawings. But as another black car rolled past the farm entrance, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger than local banks and development companies was at work. These weren't random events anymore. They felt like coordinated moves in a game he didn't yet understand. The general store hadn't changed much in 30 years. The same bell chimed above the door when Thomas entered, and Mabel still kept the penny candy in glass jars behind the counter. But today, something was different. The usual farmers and townspeople had been replaced by men and women in business attire, their voices carrying the distinct cadence of city life. "Development meeting at the town hall," Mabel explained as Thomas approached the counter. "I've been busy all morning with these folks." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "One of them was asking about you. Elegant woman. Reminded me of someone." Thomas's attention was caught by something on the counter. A business card left behind by one of the visitors. The paper was thick, expensive, with raised lettering that caught the light. Elizabeth Miller Canton, CEO, Canton Development Group. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the card. The name struck him like a physical blow. Elizabeth Miller Canton. His mother had remarried, taken a new name, built a new life, but Canton Development Group, the same company that had been buying up local farms. "She said she'd be back," Mabel added, watching his face carefully. "Left that card special, asked me to make sure you got it." Outside, Sarah was waiting in his truck, surrounded by her ever-present drawing supplies. She'd started joining him on his morning supply runs, sketching the town's old buildings while he picked up feed and hardware. Now she looked up as he returned, immediately sensing his distress. "Are you sad, Mr. Miller?" she asked, setting aside her sketchbook. "Dad says sometimes drawing helps when you're sad." Thomas managed to smile, tucking the business card into his shirt pocket. "Just thinking about family, Sarah. Sometimes they surprise you." Her face brightened, like when my aunt surprised us at Christmas. She brought presents. If only all family surprises came with such simple joy. Thomas started the truck, his mind racing. The black cars, the bank notices, the coordinated purchases, it all made a terrible kind of sense now. His mother hadn't just built a new life, she'd built an empire. And now that empire had come home. They drove past the town hall, where a cluster of expensive vehicles gleamed in the morning sun. Through the windows, Thomas caught glimpses of presentations and pointed discussions. The future of Chester County was being decided in that room, but not by the people who had worked its land for generations. "Look!" Sarah pointed to a woman emerging from the building. Even at a distance, Thomas recognized her, the same elegant posture, the same purposeful stride. 30 years had added silver to her hair, but hadn't diminished her presence. Elizabeth Miller Canton paused on the steps, speaking to a group of attendees. Then, as if sensing observation, she turned and met Thomas's gaze through the truck window. For a moment, mother and son stared at each other across 3 decades of silence. Sarah's voice broke the spell. "She looks like the lady in your barn picture." Thomas put the truck in gear, pulling away from the curb. In his pocket, the business card seemed to burn against his chest, right next to his grandfather's watch. 2 heartbeats, 2 legacies, beating against each other. Back at the farm, Mark was already at work in the garden, his borrowed tools moving with growing confidence through the soil. He looked up as they approached, his expression changing as he read Thomas's face. "Heard about the meeting in town," Mark said, leaning on his hoe. "Sarah, honey, why don't you check on those seedlings we started?" Once Sarah was out of earshot, Mark spoke quietly. "My uncle says the development company's been planning this. For months. They've got investors, permits, everything lined up. But something changed recently. The whole strategy shifted, like someone with inside knowledge took over." Thomas pulled out the business card, letting Mark read it for himself. Understanding dawned in his neighbor's eyes. "Your mother," Mark said softly. "She's the one behind it all?" Thomas stared out over his fields, where the morning sun painted everything in shades of gold. Somewhere in the distance, a cardinal called, its voice carrying across the autumn air like a warning. The Chester County Gazette had been publishing since 1892, its weekly editions chronicling the rhythms of rural life, from horse-drawn plows to GPS-guided tractors. Thomas found the latest issue on his porch that morning, the headline stark against the pale newsprint: "Local farms face extinction. Development company promises new era for Chester County." The article painted a stark picture. 6 more farms had accepted buyout offers in the past week alone. The reporter, Amy Chen, had done her homework: property records, tax assessments, zoning changes. But it was the photographs that caught Thomas's eye. Proud family farms reduced to statistics and sale prices. A quote from Elizabeth Miller Canton appeared halfway through the piece. "Chester County is ready for revitalization. We're not just building houses, we're creating opportunities for the next generation." The words were polished, practiced, but Thomas could hear his mother's voice behind them, the same tone she'd used when explaining why she had to leave. Jake arrived as Thomas was finishing the article, his own copy of the paper clutched tight. "Town meeting tonight," he said without preamble. "Emergency session, everyone's talking about this." Behind Jake's truck, Sarah and her father were walking up the drive. Mark carried a basket of early pumpkins they'd harvested together, while Sarah clutched her latest drawing, a detailed rendering of the farm's north field, complete with measurements and notes about soil composition she'd learned from Thomas. "Brought the paper?" Mark asked, setting down the pumpkins. At Thomas's nod, he continued, "My uncle's coming down from Philadelphia, says there might be some legal angles worth exploring." Thomas spread the newspaper on the hood of Jake's truck. The morning sun illuminated Elizabeth's photograph. His mother looked confident, successful, everything she'd dreamed of becoming when she left the farm. But there was something else in her expression, something that hadn't been visible during their brief encounter in town. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a detail in the article. "They're planning a community agricultural center where people can learn about farming history." Her voice carried a child's innocent excitement. Unaware of the irony, Thomas studied the proposed plans. The development would transform 4,000 acres of working farmland into a planned community, complete with luxury homes, shopping centers, and carefully manicured parks. And there in the center, a museum dedicated to preserving the rich, agricultural heritage of Chester County. They're not just buying land, Jake said quietly. They're buying our story, turning it into something people can visit on weekends. The sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. Two black SUVs rolled past the farm entrance, moving slowly. Through the tinted windows, Thomas caught a glimpse of his mother in the back seat, her attention focused on the fields his grandfather had cleared by hand 70 years ago. Sarah tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Miller, can I show you something?" She unrolled her drawing, revealing not just the measured field, but something more. A vision of the farm's future. She'd sketched greenhouses and market stands, areas for school, groups to learn about sustainable farming, and a community garden space. In the corner, she'd written, "Real farming for real people." "Dad says sometimes the best way to save something is to help it grow," she explained, her young face serious. "Like when you shared your vegetables with us." Mark stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Been thinking about that, actually. My uncle says there might be a way to create a community trust. Protect the land for agricultural use only. But it would take organization, commitment from other farmers. And money," Jake added. "Don't forget what we're up against." Thomas looked down at the newspaper again, at his mother's quote about opportunities for the next generation. Sarah's drawing still lay across it, her child's vision of the future overlaying the corporate plans. Two paths forward, as different as the life he'd lived and the one his mother had chosen. The town hall bell began to toll, calling people to the emergency meeting. Thomas folded the newspaper carefully, tucking it away with Sarah's drawing. Whatever happened next would affect not just his farm, but the entire community. A community that had grown to include the Thompsons and their dreams of a fresh start. The town hall's wooden benches were packed by the time Thomas arrived. Mark's uncle, James Thompson, was already there, his Philadelphia lawyer's suit standing out among the worn jackets and work clothes of the local farmers. He'd brought a briefcase full of documents, including one that had sent Thomas back to his own archives, the original deed to the Miller farm. Now, as Mayor Davis called the meeting to order, Thomas ran his fingers over the deed's age-softened paper. His grandfather's signature stood bold against the yellowed surface, alongside another name he hadn't expected to find: Elizabeth Ann Miller, listed as joint heir to the property. "The floor is open," Mayor Davis announced, his voice carrying decades of concern for his community. "Canton Development Group has submitted comprehensive plans for review." James Thompson stood first, his urban confidence tempered by genuine concern. "Before we proceed, I'd like to address some irregularities in the proposed rezoning, specifically the agricultural preservation clauses in many of the original deeds." A murmur ran through the crowd. Thomas felt the weight of his mother's presence before he saw her, the subtle shift in the room's energy as she entered through the side door. Elizabeth Miller Canton moved with practiced grace to the podium, her designer suit a sharp contrast to the worn wooden railings. "I understand the concerns," she began, her voice carrying the same warmth it had when reading bedtime stories 30 years ago. "Change is never easy, but Chester County is struggling. These farms, as much as we love them, are no longer viable in today's economy." Thomas stood, the old deed clutched in his hand. "Some things are worth more than money, Mother." The word hung in the air, drawing gasps from those who hadn't made the connection. Elizabeth's composure flickered for just a moment before she recovered. "Tommy," she said softly, using his childhood name. "You of all people know how hard it is to keep these farms going. I'm offering a way forward. You're offering to pave over our heritage," Jake interrupted, rising beside Thomas. "These deeds aren't just papers. They're promises made by people who understood what matters." Sarah, who had slipped in with her father, raised her hand with childhood determination. Mayor Davis, perhaps seeking to diffuse the tension, nodded to her. "My dad says promises are important," she said clearly. "Mr. Miller promised to teach me about farming, and he did. He shared his food when we were hungry. That's worth more than new houses." Elizabeth's expression softened as she studied the girl. Something shifted in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of another child shaped by rural values. James Thompson stepped forward again, indicating the deed in Thomas's hands. Mrs. Miller Canton, your name appears on several of these original deeds as a protected heir. The preservation clauses require all heirs to agree to any land use changes. Changes that, according to these documents, explicitly exclude non-agricultural development. Thomas watched his mother absorb this information, saw the familiar tightening of her jaw that preceded difficult decisions. She'd worn the same expression the day she left. The development plans include an agricultural heritage center, she offered, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. A museum about farming isn't the same as farming, Thomas said quietly. He unfolded Sarah's drawing, laying it on the podium beside his mother's glossy presentations. But maybe there's another way forward. Elizabeth studied the child's sketch, the greenhouses, the community gardens, the learning spaces. Her hand moved to her throat, where Thomas noticed she still wore the small gold locket his father had given her on their wedding day. You always did see things differently, Tommy, she said softly. Even as a child, you understood what I couldn't, that some roots go deeper than ambition. The room had grown silent, watching mother and son face each other across years of absence. Outside, through the town hall's windows, the setting sun painted the old buildings in shades of gold, much like the dawn light that had started this whole journey. Thomas spread the deed on the podium, his grandfather's watch ticking steadily. In his pocket, these signatures mean something, Mother. They're not just about ownership, they're about responsibility. To the land, to each other, to the future. Sarah had moved closer, her small hand slipping into Thomas's calloused one. Elizabeth's gaze shifted between them, then out to the familiar faces of the community she'd left behind. Faces now showing not just opposition, but hope for understanding. The morning after the town meeting, Thomas found himself back in the barn, drawn to the box of memories he'd discovered weeks earlier. This time, he dug deeper, past the photographs and old letters, to the bottom where a sealed envelope lay untouched. For 3 decades, his name was written on the front in his mother's elegant script, the paper yellowed but intact. The sound of tires on gravel warned him of approaching vehicles. Through the barn's open door, he watched the now familiar convoy of black SUVs pull up to his gate. But this time, Elizabeth didn't wait for a driver to open her door. She emerged quickly, almost urgently, her heels unsuited for the gravel drive, but her stride determined. "I couldn't sleep," she called out, spotting him in the barn's doorway. "Not after last night, not after seeing Sarah's drawing." She paused, taking in the familiar sense of hay and engine oil. "You've kept it exactly the same." Thomas held up the unopened letter. "Found this. Never knew it existed." Elizabeth's breath caught. "I wrote that the night before I left. Couldn't bring myself to give it to you." She moved closer, designer suit collecting dust from the barn's ancient timbers. "Maybe it's time you read it." With careful fingers, Thomas broke the seal. "My dearest Tommy, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not because I don't love you or your father, but because I'm afraid of what I might become if I stay. This farm, this life, it's in your blood just like it was in your father's, but in mine there's something else, a restlessness that keeps me awake at night, dreaming of horizons beyond these fields. Your father understands, even if he can't say it. He sees it when I stare at the city lights in the distance, when I read the business papers that come in the mail. I'm not made for this life of soil and seasons. My seasons are marked by quarterly reports and board meetings. But leaving you, that's the one thing I'm not sure I'm strong enough to do. You have so much of your father in you, that deep connection to the land that I never quite grasped. Sometimes I watch you in the garden, 12 years old, but already so sure of your place in the world, and I envy that certainty. Perhaps one day you'll understand that love sometimes means letting go, means trusting that the people we leave behind are strong enough to flourish without us. Your father will teach you everything about farming, But I hope you'll remember that I taught you about dreams, even the painful ones. Take care of your father, and take care of the land. Maybe someday, when I've found what I'm looking for, I'll find my way back. All my love, Mom." Thomas looked up from the letter to find tears tracking down his mother's perfectly made-up face. Behind her, Sarah stood in the barn doorway, another drawing clutched to her chest. "I did find what I was looking for," Elizabeth said quietly. "Built an empire, just like I dreamed. But standing in that town hall last night, seeing you with Sarah, it felt like looking in a mirror from 30 years ago. Only this time, I was the one trying to separate a child from the land they love." Sarah stepped forward, holding out her drawing. It showed the farm as it was now, but with additions: a modern greenhouse beside the old barn, market stalls near the road, and a small building labeled Canton Miller Agricultural Education Center. "Dad says sometimes the best future has pieces of the past in it," she said solemnly. Elizabeth took the drawing with trembling hands. "Out of the mouths of babes," she whispered. Then louder, "The development company is mine, which means I can choose its direction." She turned to Thomas. "You were right last night. A museum about farming isn't the same as farming. But maybe we can do both. Keep the land alive, but make it sustainable. Not just preserve the past, but grow into the future." The morning sun streamed through the barn doors, illuminating mother and son, the letter between them like a bridge, across 30 years of silence. In Thomas's pocket, his grandfather's watch ticked steadily, marking the moment when the past began to heal. Elizabeth spread the documents across Thomas's kitchen table, the same scarred oak surface where she'd once helped him with his homework. The business proposal was printed on Canton Development Group letterhead, but the handwritten notes in the margins showed hours of late-night revisions. "It's a hybrid model," she explained, pointing to the conceptual drawings. "We maintain the core farmland, not just yours, but Jake's property and the other remaining farms. The development gets scaled back, concentrated on the already distressed properties. But here's the key." She flipped to a page marked with financial projections. "We create an agricultural cooperative, backed by Canton Group's resources." Thomas studied the numbers while Mark and Jake leaned in from either side. The figures were dizzying: investment capital, operational budgets, projected revenues. But beneath the corporate language, he recognized something familiar: a plan to keep the land alive. "The cooperative would be managed by the farmers," Elizabeth continued. "Canton Group provides initial funding and business expertise, but operational decisions stay local. We're not just preserving farms, we're making them viable for the next generation." Sarah, who had been quietly drawing at the counter, brought her latest sketch forward. Somehow, she'd captured the essence of Elizabeth's proposal in her childlike way. The farms, connected by tree-lined paths, community gardens beside modern greenhouses, a farmer's market where families gathered. "Like this?" she asked, sliding the drawing between the professional documents. Elizabeth's face softened. "Exactly like this, sweetheart. Sometimes it takes a child's eyes to see the simplest solutions." She turned to Thomas. "The bank notices, I can have them suspended immediately. Canton Group would assume the existing mortgages, convert them to long-term, low-interest loans through the cooperative." "And the catch?" Jake asked, voicing the question they all held. "We have to prove it works," Elizabeth admitted. "The board's given me 6 months to demonstrate viability. We'll need to modernize some operations, develop new revenue streams. Educational programs, farm-to-table partnerships with restaurants, maybe even some agritourism, but done right, respecting the land and the community." Mark had been quiet, but now he spoke up. "The farming knowledge, it needs to be passed on, not just preserved in some museum, but taught. Living history. That's where you come in," Elizabeth said, surprising them all. "We need people who understand both traditional farming and modern challenges. People who can teach the next generation." She looked meaningfully at Sarah, still bent over her drawings. "People who can bridge the old and the new." Thomas pulled out his grandfather's watch, its steady ticking a counterpoint to the modern. Dreams spread across his table. The morning sun streamed through the window, catching the gold of Elizabeth's locket, the one piece of farm life she'd taken with her to the city. "It won't be easy," he said finally, "changing without losing ourselves, growing without forgetting our roots." "Nothing worthwhile ever is," Elizabeth replied. She reached across the table, her manicured hand covering his weathered one. "But you taught me something, Tommy. When you shared your harvest with Sarah's family, you showed that sometimes the best way forward is to hold on to what matters most while opening our hands to new possibilities." Outside, a cardinal landed. On the windowsill, bright red against the autumn morning, Sarah's quick pencil captured it in the corner of her drawing, a splash of hope against the practical lines of progress. "Your father used to say that the land knows what it needs," Elizabeth said softly. "Maybe what it needs now is all of us, working together. The business sense I learned in the city, the farming wisdom you kept alive here, the fresh vision Sarah brings. Perhaps that's the real harvest we've been growing all along." The architectural drawings covered the barn's workbench, their crisp lines and digital renderings a stark contrast to the hand-worn tools hanging on the wall. Elizabeth's team of designers had spent weeks developing plans that would merge modern efficiency with rural character, but something about them made Thomas's stomach tight with uncertainty. "The greenhouse positioning is crucial," the lead architect was saying, pointing to a complex diagram. "Solar optimization, water management, visitor flow, it all hinges on replacing the old barn." Thomas felt his chest constrict. "Replace the barn?" Elizabeth, standing beside him in one of her elegantly tailored suits, sensed his distress. "It's just a proposal, Tommy. Nothing's decided." But the architect continued, caught up in his vision. "The old structure's inefficient, outdated. The new facility would incorporate state-of-the-art climate control, automated irrigation, vertical growing spaces." "My grandfather built this barn," Thomas interrupted quietly. His hand rested on the workbench where 3 generations of millers had repaired tools, sorted seeds, and weathered storms. "Every beam has a story." Sarah, who had been unusually quiet during the presentation, suddenly spoke up from her corner. "What if we could keep both?" All eyes turned to her latest drawing. She'd sketched the barn as it stood, but with a modern greenhouse rising behind it, connected by a glass-enclosed walkway. The old structure housed a teaching space and heritage displays, while the new facility contained the advanced growing systems. "The past and future together," she explained with a child's simple wisdom. "Like Mr. Miller and his mom." Elizabeth moved closer to study the drawing. "The girl has a point. Our marketing team says authenticity is crucial. People want real connections to agricultural heritage." She turned to the architect. "Could we modify the plans? Keep the barn as our educational center, build the new facilities as an extension?" The architect frowned at his drawings. "It complicates things. The budget—" "I'll handle the budget," Elizabeth cut in, her CEO authority showing through. "Sometimes the most valuable assets can't be measured in square footage." Mark, who had been examining the plans with a farmer's practical eye, stepped forward. "The barn's foundation is solid. My construction experience, before the mill closed, we could reinforce the structure, add modern amenities without compromising its character." Thomas ran his hand along a beam smoothed by decades of use. The wood held memories. His father, teaching him to repair machinery, community gatherings during harvest, the quiet mornings when he'd found solace here after his mother left. "Sarah," he called softly, "bring your drawing here." She came forward, clutching her sketch. Thomas lifted her onto the workbench, the same way his father had lifted him years ago to learn about tools and timing and tradition. "Show us how." "You see it working," he encouraged. With growing confidence, Sarah explained her vision. The old barn would become a living classroom where traditional farming methods could be demonstrated alongside modern techniques. The greenhouse would showcase innovative growing systems, but its design would echo the barn's classic lines. A covered marketplace would connect the structures, providing year-round space for community gatherings and farm sales. Elizabeth watched. Her son and the young girl, something softening in her expression. "You know, Tommy, when I left, I thought I had to choose between tradition and progress. But maybe Sarah's right. Maybe the real opportunity is in bringing them together." The architect had begun sketching revisions, incorporating elements from Sarah's drawing. "We could preserve the original timbers," he mused, "use them as architectural features in the new construction. A physical connection between old and new." Outside, the sound of Jake's tractor rumbled past, another reminder of the practical realities they faced. The farm needed to evolve to survive, but evolution didn't have to mean erasure. Thomas took out his grandfather's watch, its steady ticking a reminder of time's forward march. The morning sun through the barn's weathered boards cast strips of light across the drawings, both the architect's precise renderings and Sarah's heartfelt sketch. In that moment he could almost see the future taking shape, a place where past and present met, where the wisdom of generations could guide the dreams of tomorrow. The recipe book emerged from a box of old papers Elizabeth had brought from her Philadelphia home. Its leather cover was cracked with age, the pages stained with decades of cooking spills and margin notes. Thomas recognized his grandmother's handwriting immediately, the same careful script that had labeled every jar in her root cellar. "Found it while I was packing," Elizabeth said, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the book. "I took it the day I left, couldn't bear to leave it behind." They sat at the kitchen table, morning light streaming through windows that needed washing. Sarah had joined them, drawn by the mysterious power of the old book, while Mark and Jake gathered around with steaming coffee mugs. "Your grandmother's pickle recipe," Elizabeth murmured, touching a page spotted with vinegar stains. "Remember how the whole house would smell of dill and garlic every September?" Thomas nodded, the memory sharp and clear. "You used to help her, slicing cucumbers while she measured out the spices." "I did more than that," Elizabeth said softly. She turned to a page where her own younger handwriting flowed between his grandmother's notes. "I learned everything she would teach me, not just recipes, but timing, patience, the rhythm of seasons." Her voice caught. "I told myself I was running away from all this, but I took her lessons with me. Board meetings are just another kind of harvest, Tommy. You plan, you plant, you tend, you reap." Sarah leaned forward, pointing to a pressed flower that had fallen from between the pages. "What's this?" "Borage," Thomas and Elizabeth said simultaneously, then shared a surprised laugh. "Your grandfather planted it for the bees," Elizabeth explained, touching the dried bloom gently. "But your grandmother loved it in salads, said its blue flowers made every meal special." Thomas noticed his mother's eyes grow distant with memory. "There's borage in the garden now," he said. "Same plot, still coming up volunteer after all these years." Elizabeth's corporate polish cracked slightly. "Show me." They walked together to the kitchen garden, Sarah skipping ahead. The borage grew in a sunny corner, its star-shaped flowers nodding in the morning breeze. Elizabeth knelt, heedless of her designer skirt, to touch a leaf. "The leaves still smell like cucumber," she whispered. After all this time, Sarah had brought her ever-present sketchbook. "Can I draw it for the new garden plan?" "Better than that," Elizabeth said, straightening up. "We could incorporate heritage plantings into the demonstration gardens. Your grandmother's varieties, Tommy, the ones she spent years selecting. For our soil and climate. Those seeds, did you keep them?" Thomas nodded toward the barn. "Every one. She taught me how to save them, store them, even showed me her coding system." He paused. "I've been teaching Sarah." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "I forgot how much she taught us. Not just about farming, but about roots, the kind that go deeper than soil." She looked at her son. "I thought I had to choose between her world and the future I wanted, but she was already showing us how to bridge them." Sarah had begun sketching, her pencil capturing not just the borage, but the three of them standing there, Thomas solid as an oak, Elizabeth elegant but softening, and herself in the middle, connecting them. Mark appeared from the barn, holding seed packets labelled in Thomas's grandmother's handwriting. Found these while checking the storage systems. Temperature and humidity controls are still working. She was ahead of her time with those innovations. Elizabeth took a packet, reading the careful notes. She was, she said wonderingly. All those things I went searching for in the corporate world, efficiency, innovation, growth, she was already practicing them here, just in a different language. Jake joined them, carrying the recipe book. Community section, he said, opening to a page filled with notes about shared meals and harvest celebrations. Your grandmother kept records of every gathering. Who brought what, who needed extra that year, who had skills to share. A social network, Elizabeth murmured. Before we had social networks. She looked around the garden, seeing it with new eyes. We're not just preserving recipes and seeds, are we? We're preserving a way of knowing, a way of belonging. Sarah held up her drawing. She'd added details, the recipe book open on a modern teaching kitchen counter, seed packets displayed alongside tablets showing weather data, the borage flowers threading through it all like a living connection. History and future, she said simply, like the barn and the greenhouse. Thomas felt something shift and settle in his chest, like earth after a healing rain. His grandmother's wisdom, his mother's ambition, Sarah's fresh vision, they were all pieces of the same story, a story written in recipes and roots, and the patient turning of seasons. The marketing team from Canton Development had spread their proposals across the kitchen table. Sleek designs featuring stylized wheat sheaves and modern fonts. Elizabeth studied them with a CEO's critical eye while Thomas stood at the window, watching Sarah in the garden. The young girl was sketching again, her pencil moving with unusual purpose. They're professional, Thomas said, turning back to the logos. But they don't feel like us. Elizabeth nodded, pushing the designs aside. Too corporate. We need something that tells the real story. She touched one of the rejected designs. Though I do like how they've incorporated the idea of growth and heritage. Sarah came running in from the garden, her sketchpad clutched tight. I made something. She laid her drawing on top of the professional designs, and both adults leaned in closer. The logo she'd created was deceptively simple. The outline of the old barn merged with the shape of the new greenhouse, forming a single structure that somehow captured both past and future. Around the edge, in a circle, she'd drawn a continuous line of growing plants, beginning as seeds, rising to mature crops, then returning to seeds again. But what caught everyone's attention was how she'd incorporated the Miller family watch into the design, its face becoming a rising sun over the barn greenhouse. Sarah, Elizabeth breathed, this is perfect, Thomas finished. He pulled his grandfather's watch from his pocket, comparing it to the drawing. How did you know to make the watch face look like a sun? Sarah pointed to the kitchen window. That's how the sun looks through the barn boards in the morning, like time and light, making stripes together. The marketing team exchanged glances. Their lead designer reached for Sarah's drawing, studying it with professional interest. The symbolism is actually quite sophisticated. The circular motif suggests continuity, while the merged structures create a sense of harmonious transition. We could refine this, maintain the core concept, but polish the execution. Not too polished, Elizabeth interrupted, surprising them all. It needs to keep this authenticity. She turned to her son. What do you think, Tommy? Thomas was still holding his grandfather's watch, its steady ticking a counterpoint to the modern buzz of laptops and tablets around his kitchen table. It's who we are, he said simply, who we've always been, and who we're becoming. Mark and Jake arrived as the design team was packing up, Sarah's drawing now carefully preserved in a professional portfolio. They brought news from the community meeting. Other farmers were showing interest in the cooperative model, drawn by the promise of maintaining independence while gaining modern support. Wilson's asking if he can buy back in, Jake reported. Says his grandkids saw the educational program plans and won't stop talking about farming. Elizabeth smiled. The next generation leading the way again. She looked meaningfully at Sarah, who had returned to her usual spot by the window, already working on another drawing. Sometimes it takes a child's eyes to see the truth of things. Thomas watched as his mother walked to the window, her corporate armor softening as she knelt beside Sarah. The girl showed her the new sketch, a detailed plan for the heritage garden they'd discussed, incorporating his grandmother's favorite, flowers alongside modern vertical growing systems. You've captured exactly what I couldn't see 30 years ago, Elizabeth said softly, more to herself than to Sarah. That growth doesn't mean forgetting, that moving forward can mean spiraling, up instead of running away. The marketing team's car pulled out of the driveway, carrying Sarah's logo design toward its future as the new face of the Miller Canton Agricultural Cooperative. Thomas touched the watch in his pocket, thinking of all the mornings it had marked, all the seasons it had witnessed. Now it would become part of their new identity, measuring time not just in hours, but in generations. Outside, the autumn light painted everything in shades of gold and possibility. The old barn stood proud against the sky, waiting for its new companion greenhouse to rise beside it. Like the logo Sarah had drawn, like the family gathered in the warm kitchen, it would be a bridge between what was and what could be. A promise, kept, a future grown from well-tended roots. The partnership agreement lay open on the same oak table where Elizabeth had announced her departure 3 decades earlier. Now, on a bright autumn morning, she sat beside Thomas, their hands nearly touching as they reviewed the final draft. Mark's uncle James had outdone himself, crafting a document that protected both the land's agricultural heritage and its potential for sustainable growth. It's more than a business contract, James explained, adjusting his Philadelphia lawyer's tie. We've created a living trust that ensures the land remains agricultural while allowing for educational and innovative development. The cooperative structure gives every participating farmer a voice in decisions. Elizabeth traced her finger along a particularly crucial clause. The Canton Group commits to initial capitalization and ongoing support, but operational control stays with the farming community. She looked at Thomas. Your father would have appreciated this part, the requirement that traditional farming knowledge be documented and passed on. Sarah sat between them, her latest sketchbook open to detailed drawings of the planned teaching gardens. She'd become an unofficial bridge between the corporate team and the local farmers, her artwork somehow translating between spreadsheets and soil wisdom. Look, she said, pointing to a section of the agreement. That's where it says about my garden classes. Indeed, the document included provisions for youth education programs, with Sarah's successful pilot project cited as a model. The girl who had once watched hungrily through a garden fence would now help other children connect with the land. Mark cleared his throat. There's something else we'd like to add. He nodded to Sarah, who pulled out a carefully folded paper from her pocket. It was her original drawing of Thomas sharing vegetables with her family, the one that had started everything. We think it should be the cooperative's mission statement, Mark said quietly. Not just the words, but the actual drawing, a reminder of why we're doing this. Elizabeth took the drawing with gentle hands, a perfect addition. Sometimes the simplest gestures have the most profound effects. She looked at her son. You taught me that, Tommy. Thomas reached for his grandfather's watch, its weight familiar and comforting, but before he could take it out, Elizabeth spoke again. I have something for you. She opened her briefcase and removed an old wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. Found this in my office safe, been keeping it there all these years, though I'm not sure why. Inside lay another pocket watch, identical to the one Thomas carried. Your grandfather had 2 made, Elizabeth explained, one for each of his children. Your father got his. This one was meant for me, but She paused. I left it behind that day. Couldn't bear to take it then. And now? Thomas asked softly. Elizabeth lifted the watch, its gold case catching the morning light. Now I understand what it really means. Not just about keeping time, but about keeping faith with the land, with each other, with the future. She turned to Sarah. Would you like to learn how to wind it? As Elizabeth showed Sarah the proper technique for maintaining the delicate mechanism, Thomas watched the faces around his kitchen table. Jake, who had stood by him through the hardest years. Mark, who had brought new energy and ideas to the farm. James, whose legal expertise had helped them find a path forward. And his mother, finally finding her way home by helping to build something new. The agreement waited for their signatures, its pages promising a future none of them could have imagined months ago. The Miller Canton Agricultural Cooperative would preserve the best of the past while nurturing seeds of innovation. The development company's resources would flow not into suburban sprawl, but into sustainable farming practices, educational programs, and community renewal. Time to make it official, James said, offering his pen. One by one they signed. Elizabeth's elegant script, Thomas's steady hand, Mark's careful strokes. Even Sarah was given a space to sign as the cooperative's youth education coordinator, her signature careful and proud. Outside, a cardinal landed on the windowsill, bright red against the autumn morning, like nature herself offering approval. The watch in Elizabeth's hands ticked in perfect synchronization with the one in Thomas's pocket, marking the moment when past and future finally found their harmony. The first harvest under the new partnership dawned clear and cool, dew sparkling on the modern greenhouse panels beside the restored barn. Thomas stood at the edge of the teaching garden, both grandfather's watches tucked safely in his pockets, their synchronized ticking marking time as the sun rose over transformed fields. Elizabeth emerged from the farmhouse carrying 2 thermoses of coffee, dressed not in her usual business suit, but in practical work clothes, her silver hair tied back in a farmer's bandana. Just like old times, she said, handing him a thermos. Though I don't remember the morning crew being quite so large. Indeed, the farm's gravel drive was filling with vehicles, Jake's trusty truck, Mark's family car, and a small fleet of Canton Group vans carrying the first batch of agricultural students. The pilot program had drawn participants from across 3 counties, drawn by the promise of learning both traditional farming wisdom and modern sustainable practices. Sarah was already in the teaching garden, arranging her hand-drawn instruction cards beside each bed. Over the past months, she'd created an entire curriculum in pictures, making complex farming concepts accessible to students of all ages. Her father worked nearby, checking the new irrigation system that blended gravity-fed traditional methods with computer-controlled efficiency. First group's here for the Heritage Tomato Workshop, Mark called out, consulting a tablet with the day's schedule. The screen displayed Sarah's logo, the merged barn and greenhouse glowing digital against the autumn morning. Thomas watched the students gather, their excitement palpable. Among them were Ruth Wilson's grandchildren, their eyes wide as they took in the changes to the land they'd thought lost to development. The old barn had become a living classroom, its restored walls now housing displays of agricultural history, alongside modern monitoring equipment. "Remember how you taught me about tomatoes?" Sarah asked, joining Thomas and Elizabeth. "Now we get to teach everyone." She wore a name badge with her official title, Youth Education Coordinator. Beneath it, she'd pinned one of her first drawings of the farm. Elizabeth touched her watch, its face catching the morning light. "Your grandmother would have loved this," she said softly. "She always said knowledge not shared was like an unharvested field, a waste of precious resources." The students assembled in the teaching garden, where heritage tomato plants grew alongside their modern hybrid cousins. Sarah began the lesson, her young voice clear and confident as she explained how traditional saving techniques preserved genetic diversity, while new methods improved yield and disease resistance. Thomas and Elizabeth moved through the group, adding their different perspectives, his generations of hands-on experience complementing her understanding of agricultural markets and distribution networks. Together they painted a picture of farming's future that honored its past while embracing innovation. "Look at this," Jake called from the greenhouse entrance. The automated systems had begun their morning routine, roof panels adjusting to optimize light, while sensors monitored soil conditions. Through the glass walls, they could see the vertical growing stations Elizabeth's team had designed based on Sarah's original sketches. A Canton Group photographer moved through the scene, capturing images for the cooperative's website, but it was Sarah's artistic eye that truly documented the day's significance. Her sketchbook recorded not just the activities, but the connections being formed, young hands learning from old, traditional wisdom flowing into new forms, a community growing stronger through shared purpose. The morning light strengthened, illuminating the face of the restored barn, where Sarah's logo now hung proudly. Inside, Thomas's grandmother's recipe book had been digitized, its wisdom preserved and expanded with notes from participating farmers. The old root cellar now housed a climate-controlled seed bank, protecting heritage varieties for future generations. Mark approached with another group of students, these ones from the local high school's agricultural science program. "Ready for the soil composition workshop?" he asked. "We're using the analysis equipment in the new lab, but we're starting with your father's method of reading the land." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of both watches in his pockets. 2 timepieces, 2 generations, 2 approaches to working. The land, all ticking forward together into a future that none of them could have imagined when Sarah first watched through the garden fence. The autumn air carried the scent of ripening crops and fresh possibilities. Above the teaching garden, a family of cardinals darted between old trees and new trellises, their red feathers bright against the morning sky. "Good luck," Thomas's mother had always said, or perhaps just nature's way of celebrating when growth and wisdom flowed together in proper season. The wedding invitation arrived with the morning mail, its cream-colored envelope standing out among the cooperative's business correspondence. Thomas recognized his mother's handwriting immediately, the same elegant script that had graced her long-ago letters from Philadelphia. Inside, the card bore Sarah's logo, now familiar throughout Chester County, with a simple announcement beneath, "Elizabeth Miller Canton and James Thompson request the pleasure of your company." The date was set for early spring, when the teaching gardens would be in full bloom. "Uncle James and your mom," Sarah's voice carried from the kitchen doorway, where she stood with her latest sketchpad. "Is that why they kept having meetings about legal matters?" Thomas smiled, remembering the long discussions that had stretched past sunset, the way his mother and Mark's uncle had lingered over contract details, their heads bent close together, over cups of cooling coffee. Seems some partnerships grow beyond business. Elizabeth's Canton Group car pulled into the drive, but she wasn't alone. James was with her, and in the back seat sat an elderly figure Thomas hadn't seen in decades, his mother's sister, Aunt Grace, who had followed her own dreams to California's wine country years ago. Couldn't wait to share the news in person. Elizabeth called out, her face glowing with more than just morning sun. She wore her corporate clothes, but a garden trowel peeked from her briefcase, and dirt smudged her designer shoes. "Grace flew in early to help with the planning, and to see what we've built here." Aunt Grace emerged from the car slowly, her keen eyes taking in the changes to her childhood home. The restored barn wore its new purpose with dignity. Solar panels, gleaming beside century-old beams. The teaching greenhouse caught morning light like a crystal growing from ancient soil. And everywhere, Sarah's artistic touch merged past and future. Heritage plants in modern beds, traditional wisdom on digital displays. "It's not what I expected," Grace admitted, accepting Thomas's arm as they walked toward the house. "When Elizabeth told me she was returning to the farm, I thought." She paused, watching a group of students arrive for the day's workshops. "Well, I thought she was giving up her dreams. But this isn't giving up at all, is it? More like growing. New dreams from old roots, James said, his lawyer's precision softened by obvious affection. He had loosened his tie, looking more country gentleman than city professional. Elizabeth showed me that progress doesn't have to erase history, it can enhance it. Sarah had been quietly sketching as they talked, her pencil moving with practiced confidence. Now she turned her pad to show them the wedding scene she imagined, set between the barn and greenhouse. She'd drawn the guests seated in the heritage garden, paths lined with Elizabeth's mother's favorite flowers, the two family watches merged into a single symbol of time flowing forward. Perfect, Elizabeth breathed, taking the drawing. Absolutely. Perfect. Sarah, would you consider being our official wedding artist? We'd love to use your designs for everything, programs, decorations, even the cake. Sarah's face lit up, but before she could respond, another car appeared. Mark's sister's minivan carrying more unexpected guests. Word of the engagement had spread through the tight-knit farming community, bringing a steady stream of visitors, bearing congratulations and covered dishes. By noon, the kitchen overflowed with 3 generations of family and friends. Jake brought his famous cornbread, made with heritage corn grown in the teaching gardens. Mark's mother arrived with her secret recipe pickles, declaring they'd make perfect wedding favors. Even Ruth Wilson stopped by, her grandchildren racing to show Sarah their progress in the youth farming program. Thomas found his mother by the window, watching the impromptu gathering with bright eyes. Both watches ticked in his pockets, keeping time with the rhythm of celebration. "Did you ever imagine this?" he asked softly. "When you left all those years ago?" Elizabeth touched the gold locket she still wore, a piece of farm life she'd carried through her corporate years. "I thought I had to choose between worlds," she said. "Between ambition and roots, between growth and tradition." She looked at James, who was earnestly discussing organic certification with Jake. "But love has a way of teaching us that the best growth comes from strong roots." Outside, Aunt Grace had settled into a garden chair, surrounded by eager students as she shared stories of farming in 2 different worlds. Sarah sat at her feet, sketchpad ready, capturing another piece of family history to weave into their growing tapestry of old and new. 1 year later, Thomas stood in the autumn morning light, both grandfathers' watches marking time in his pockets. The farm had transformed beyond even Sarah's early drawings, yet somehow remained deeply, essentially itself. Like a well-tended perennial, it had grown into a fuller version of what it had always been meant to be. The new family portrait hung in the renovated barn's entrance. Elizabeth and James, now married a half year, standing with Thomas between the heritage garden and modern greenhouse. Sarah sat cross-legged in front, surrounded by her artwork showing the farm's journey. Mark and his family stood alongside Jake and other cooperative members, the whole community gathered under the banner of Sarah's logo. "Time for the Harvest Festival," Elizabeth called from the house. She wore gardening clothes, now more often than business suits, though she still managed the Canton Group's agricultural initiatives. Her corporate expertise, tempered by renewed connection to the land, had helped the cooperative exceed all expectations. Sarah, now 11 and the cooperative's most passionate advocate, led a group of younger children through the teaching garden. "These tomatoes," she explained, "come from seeds Mr. Miller's grandmother saved. And these ones beside them are the new varieties we developed in the greenhouse. Together, they make the best sauce." Thomas watched the students gather around her, their eager faces reminding him of Sarah at the fence just over a year ago. That simple act of sharing produce had grown into something extraordinary, a model of sustainable farming that other communities were already beginning to adopt. Mark approached, carrying files from the latest cooperative meeting. 6 more farms joining next season, he reported. And the school board approved our expanded agricultural education program. The morning sun caught the dew on new growth and old buildings alike, each enhanced by the other's presence. In the distance, A family of cardinals darted between heritage, apple trees and modern trellises, still bringing luck, still marking moments of change and promise. Thomas felt the steady ticking of the watches against his chest, two heartbeats in perfect synchronization. Like the farm itself, they measured more than just time. They measured the flow of wisdom between generations, the slow, sure growth of dreams planted in well-tended soil. Sarah's voice carried across the morning air, sharing her grandfather's farming wisdom with a new generation. Above her, the Miller Canton Cooperative logo caught the light, the merged barn and greenhouse, the watches marking time's forward flow, the continuous circle of growing things returning to their roots only, to rise again, renewed and strengthened by the journey home.